Hash the 10 cruelest kings in history. Power does strange things to people. Give someone absolute control over life and death, and you find out pretty fast what they're really made of. History is full of kings who had everything: crowns, armies, palaces, and used all of it to make people suffer in ways that still make us wince centuries later. Today we're going through 10 of the cruelest kings who ever lived. Some names you'll know instantly. Others are going to surprise you, guys you've probably never heard of but who make the famous tyrants look almost tame. And for each one, we're not just going to list the horrors, we're going to dig into why, what made them this way. Because nobody wakes up one day and decides to become a monster for no reason. There's always a path that gets them there. So get comfortable, because this one gets dark. Let's start with a name everybody knows. Ivan the Terrible, the first Tsar of Russia. Now the nickname in Russian actually translates closer to Ivan the Formidable, or Ivan the Fearsome. But let's be honest, terrible fits just fine too. Ivan's childhood was basically a horror story before he ever picked up a crown. His father died when he was 3, his mother died when he was 8, probably poisoned. And after that, he was raised in a court full of scheming nobles called boyars who fought each other for power and treated the little kid on the throne like he didn't matter. They'd starve him, humiliate him, ignore him for days, and then suddenly parade him around like a prince when it suited their politics. Imagine growing up like that, constantly told you're powerful but treated like you're worthless. By the time Ivan actually took real control, something in him had snapped. He became obsessed with loyalty and betrayal, seeing enemies everywhere. He created this secret police force called the Oprichniki, men dressed in black riding black horses, and he unleashed them on entire cities he suspected of disloyalty. The most infamous case was the massacre of Novgorod, where his men tortured and killed thousands of people, men, women, children, over the accusation that the city was plotting to defect to Poland. There was barely any evidence. It didn't matter. And here's the detail that always gets people. In a fit of rage, Ivan struck his own son, also named Ivan, in the head with his royal staff. His son died from the wound. The man who feared betrayal so much that he slaughtered thousands ended up killing the one person who was actually loyal to him, his own child. That single moment says everything about how paranoia can eat a person alive. Next, let's go somewhere a lot of people skip over. Central Africa, late 1800s. King Leopold II of Belgium. Now technically Leopold wasn't a king of a country called Congo. He was king of Belgium, but he personally owned the Congo Free State as his private property. Not as a colony of Belgium, but literally his own personal possession, like a private estate the size of Western Europe. And what he did there is one of the most horrifying chapters in human history that barely gets taught in schools. Leopold wanted rubber. The industrial world was booming and rubber was suddenly worth a fortune. So he set up a system where Congolese villages were given brutal quotas of rubber they had to produce. If a village failed to meet the quota, soldiers working for Leopold would show up and do unthinkable things. They would cut off the hands of men, women, and children as punishment, sometimes even when people had met their quotas, just to prove bullets weren't being wasted. Historians estimate that under Leopold's rule, somewhere between 5 and 10 million Congolese people died from murder, starvation, exhaustion, and disease caused by this forced labor system. 10 million. And Leopold himself never set foot in the Congo. He ran this entire horror show from a palace in Belgium, getting richer and richer while people on the other side of the world were mutilated for not gathering enough sap from trees. Why did he do it? Simple. Money and ego. Leopold desperately wanted Belgium to be seen as a major world power with a colonial empire like Britain or France. When the government wouldn't fund his colonial ambitions, he found the Congo and made it his personal cash machine. There's no tragic backstory here, no traumatic childhood turning him into a monster. Leopold is one of those rare cases where the cruelty came from pure greed and the intoxicating feeling of having a huge slice of the world with literally nobody able to stop him. Let's go back further in time now, to ancient history. To a king that even other tyrants would have feared, Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon. Now Nebuchadnezzar built an incredible empire and is remembered for the legendary Hanging Gardens. But his cruelty came out hard against anyone who defied him. When the kingdom of Judah rebelled against Babylonian rule, Nebuchadnezzar crushed it without mercy. He destroyed Jerusalem, tore down the temple, and forced thousands of Jewish people into exile in what's known as the Babylonian captivity. But it's the personal cruelty that stands out most. When he captured King Zedekiah of Judah for breaking his oath of loyalty, Nebuchadnezzar didn't just execute him. He forced Zedekiah to watch his own sons be killed in front of him as the last thing he would ever see, and then had his eyes gouged out so that image would be permanently burned into his mind before dragging him off in chains to Babylon. Why so specific, so theatrical in his cruelty? Because in that era, kings ruled through fear and symbolism. A public, brutal punishment like that wasn't random. It was a message to every other kingdom watching. Break your word to Babylon, and this is what happens. Nebuchadnezzar wasn't necessarily a madman by nature. He was a calculated ruler who understood that terror was a tool of statecraft, and he used it with surgical precision. Now let's talk about a king whose name has literally become slang for a tyrant. Vlad III of Wallachia, better known as Vlad the Impaler, the inspiration for Dracula. Vlad's method of choice, as his nickname suggests, was impalement. He would have people, sometimes thousands at a time, driven through with long wooden stakes, and the stakes would then be planted upright in the ground so the person would die slowly, often over hours or even days in horrific agony. And he didn't just do this to enemy soldiers. He did it to merchants who cheated customers, to Ottoman invaders, to political rivals, and reportedly to entire villages as a warning to anyone thinking of betraying him. There's one story where Ottoman envoys refused to remove their turbans in his presence out of religious custom. Vlad's response was to have the turbans nailed to their heads. Whether or not every story about Vlad is historically accurate, the reputation was terrifying enough that when an actual Ottoman army marched toward his capital, they retreated after finding a field of 20,000 impaled corpses left as decoration along the road, a display known as the Forest of the Impaled. So why did Vlad become this way? His childhood gives a huge clue. As a boy, Vlad was sent as a political hostage to the Ottoman Empire to guarantee his father's loyalty. There, he was reportedly beaten and abused by his captors while also being trained militarily. He grew up watching his own father get betrayed and assassinated by Wallachian nobles, followed by his older brother being tortured and buried alive by those same enemies. Vlad came back from captivity not just traumatized, but obsessed with control and vengeance against the very nobility that destroyed his family. His brutality was, in a twisted way, a direct product of the brutality he witnessed growing up. Now let's talk about a king a lot of people don't know at all, but whose story is absolutely chilling. King Shaka of the Zulu Kingdom, in what's now South Africa in the early 1800s. Shaka was a military genius, honestly one of the greatest tactical minds in African history, revolutionizing warfare with new weapons and formations that let the Zulu build a massive empire in a short time. But his personal cruelty, especially later in his reign, became legendary for how disturbing it was. The turning point was when his mother Nandi died. Shaka's grief spiraled into something horrifying. He declared a mourning period so extreme that anyone found not grieving intensely enough was executed on the spot. Reports describe thousands of people killed during this period simply for not crying hard enough or not looking sad enough in his presence. He banned the planting of crops for a year and ordered that milk, a staple of Zulu life, couldn't be used, causing widespread starvation on top of the executions. To understand Shaka, you have to understand his childhood, which was rough from the very beginning. He was born out of wedlock, which was scandalous in his society, and he and his mother were essentially exiled and mocked for years, moving from place to place, treated as outcasts. Shaka grew up bullied and humiliated, and by the time he had power, he ruled with a mix of brilliance and absolute paranoia about ever being humiliated or abandoned again. His mother was the one stable thing in his miserable childhood, and when she died, whatever control he had over his darker impulses died with her. Let's move to Europe again, for someone who ruled with almost bureaucratic cruelty. King Christian VII of Denmark doesn't usually make these lists, but stick with this one because it's a wild story, though in his case the cruelty is more complicated because of his mental state. Christian was likely affected by serious mental illness, possibly schizophrenia, made worse by the fact that as a child he was raised under an incredibly strict, isolating court routine designed to make him a perfect future king. Instead, it seems to have broken him psychologically. As king, he would have violent outbursts, self-harm, and disturbing behavior in public. But because he was king, the people around him didn't get him help. They exploited him. His personal physician, a man named Struensee, basically took control of the government while Christian spiraled, and used the king's mental instability to enact his own agenda, all while the actual suffering of everyday niche people under a chaotic, unstable government continued because nobody would address the fact that their king simply could not rule. Christian story is less about intentional cruelty and more a warning about what happens when a fragile, damaged person is placed in a position of absolute power with nobody willing to say the system needs to change. The result was years of instability and suffering for the people simply because removing a king, even one who couldn't function, was almost unthinkable at the time. Now here's a name that should send chills down anyone's spine. King Andrian Ampoina Marina doesn't quite fit. Let's talk instead about someone far more universally brutal in that region's history, Ranavalona I, Queen of Madagascar, though she ruled with the full power and title equivalent to any king, and her methods are almost too horrific to summarize quickly. Ranavalona came to power after her husband's death through a palace coup, and to secure her throne she immediately had every other rival claimant to the crown executed, including members of her own extended family. But it's her treatment of Christians and foreign influence in Madagascar that made her infamous. She saw European missionaries and the growing Christian population as a direct threat to her authority and traditional culture, so she outlawed Christianity entirely. Her punishment methods were creative in the worst way. She used trial by poison, where accused people were forced to eat a poisonous nut, and if they survived they were innocent. Almost nobody survived. She also used a method where the accused were thrown off cliffs, boiled alive, or literally cut apart limb by limb in public executions meant to terrify the population into obedience. Estimates suggest her policies and executions led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of her own people over her reign, in a country with a relatively small population at the time, making the proportional death toll staggering. Why so extreme? Ranavalona took the throne as a woman in a deeply patriarchal system, through a coup that many considered illegitimate. Every single day she ruled, she faced the threat of being overthrown by people who felt she didn't deserve the crown. Her extreme cruelty was, in her own twisted logic, a survival strategy. If everyone was too terrified to even think about rebellion, she couldn't be overthrown. Fear became her form of self-preservation, even as it destroyed her country. Let's jump to a very different kind of cruelty now. More personal, more petty, with King Henry VIII of England, someone everybody's heard of but maybe don't fully realize how brutal he actually was beyond just his famous marriages. Henry executed two of his own wives, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, on charges that were flimsy at best, essentially because he wanted them gone and needed a legal excuse. But beyond his marriages, Henry's reign involved the executions of thousands of people during the dissolution of the monasteries, when he seized Catholic Church property across England and crushed any resistance, including brutally suppressing a massive uprising called the Pilgrimage of Grace, where he promised leaders mercy to get them to stand down, then executed them anyway once they did. Henry started his reign as a genuinely promising, athletic, charismatic young king that people adored. So what changed him? A combination of things. A jousting accident left him with a leg injury that never healed properly, causing him constant pain for the rest of his life, and possibly brain damage from the head trauma during the fall. He also became desperate, almost unhinged, in his need for a male heir, seeing it as the only way to secure his dynasty and avoid the civil wars that had plagued England before his family took power. That desperation, combined with chronic pain and unchecked absolute power, turned an admired young king into a paranoid, vindictive man who saw threats to his throne everywhere and eliminated them without hesitation. Now for someone truly obscure that most people watching this have never heard of. King Charles II of Spain, nicknamed El Hechizado, the Bewitched, because people at the time thought he must be cursed. Charles wasn't cruel through violence exactly, but through generations of Habsburg royal inbreeding that left him physically and mentally disabled to an extreme degree. He couldn't chew properly because his jaw was so deformed, he drooled constantly, struggled to speak clearly, and was likely infertile, which meant he had no heir. His cruelty came from the chaos his existence caused. Because he couldn't produce an heir, and because he was manipulated by various factions in his own court desperate to control the succession, his reign became one of the most corrupt